Happy birthday, Steve. Thank you for all your hard work and sacrifices, building movement and stuff. And I really appreciate you allowing me the opportunity to have something to do today. I hope you have a great birthday. Talk to you soon.
Happy birthday, Steve. Thank you so much for working so hard and doing everything that you do. Make sure to take it easy today.
I hope you have a very wonderful birthday. Have a happy day.
Hey, Steve. Savage Joy from Real Progressives. Just want to say happy birthday. I've known you a little over 2 years now, and we don't always agree on everything, and we're both stubborn as fuck. But you know, you're my brother, and at the end of the day, we're fighting for the same exact things. Have some food, have some cake, have some time with your wife and Butters, and just have a good day. So happy birthday, and best wishes for the year to come.
Well, it's a great day for a birthday, and you've got one. I hope you're not getting too old. Happy birthday, Steve. Have a great day.
This is Rob. I just wanted to give a special birthday shout out to our founder, Steve Grumbine. Steve, we appreciate all you've done for us, all you've done for our movement. I hope you have a wonderful day today and have a happy Easter.
Happy birthday, Steve. To the man who's worked tirelessly for the progressive movement and who's been a great friend and mentor to all of us at Real Progressives, thank you. And I hope you enjoy your day.
All right, folks. Thank you so much for my team who was kind enough to make that. I'm very, very humbled. I mean, it's like, wow. Thank you guys so much. I want to tell you, today I've got a phenomenal guest. He's been on before. This gentleman right here has such an incredible history, such a great credentials, such a wonderful perspective. I love every minute I get to spend with him. Without further ado, I want to bring on my guest, Dr. Bob Hockett. Welcome, sir. How are you today?
Hey, Steve. Doing really well. Thanks so much. And I couldn't be more honored to have you, for you to have me on during your birthday. What an honor.
An April Fool, an Easter Fool, and
Passover, April Fool's Day, your birthday, and then you get the biggest fool of them all here today as your guest. So thanks so much for having me on. This really is an honor. And my gosh, just listening to the testimonials just now about you, I mean, I couldn't be more moved. You are a national treasure. And the fact that you're doing this even on your birthday is just, I mean, there's no better proof of it. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it immensely. You know, when we left off last time you were on here, we had talked offline about how much we were both moved by the idea not only of movement building, but the history of revolution in this country, and how not just this country, but in general around the world, and how revolutions brew up, they fail, the reasons why they fail, and some of the issues surrounding, you know, like modern society today here in the United States, as people don't realize what they're up against. I mean, I'm just going to speak from my perspective, my junior varsity perspective, because you guys are in the bigs here. We're sitting here looking at folks like the Pete Peterson Foundation, who, you know, bye-bye Papa Pete. The rest, I mean, these guys are soaked in millions of dollars of money, ready to literally shred us down to no safety net, shred us down to the most austere measures. And we really don't have a voice. I mean, even the progressive movement, even the Democratic Party, the Green Party, they don't have an economic message at this time that can overcome that. They don't have a story that can overcome that. And the other side of the game is so organized, so consistent in its message. It's so simple, and yet it's so wrong. Talk to me a little bit about why we are where we are, and maybe some of the things we could do differently.
Yeah, so I think there may be a few things at work here. And again, this is, I can't purport to be an expert, but just from my point of view, what I seem to see are maybe the following things. First of all, we talk about there being an us or a we, right? We talk about the Constitution, and we talk about the preamble, which of course reads we, comma, the people. Every time we say we sort of presuppose that there's something that we have, right? That we're a country, we're a society, we have some kind of polity that we ourselves have founded. The Constitution supposedly records or memorializes this thing that we have done. But what I'm sort of struck by is how much we don't have that you would normally think any politically constituted we would have. So, for example, we don't really have a coherent public square in the way that one might have wished or one might have hoped. So if you think about like a New England town meeting or a little sort of local democracy in a township or a city back in the early days of the country, there would be something that you could call a public square. And everybody who constituted that little polity, which was that city, which was that village, could actually go and listen to one another and speak to one another in one space, and they would hear one another, and they could form, in a certain sense, a kind of common mind, right? As a nation, we can kind of do that, or we could kind of do that if we had some sort of some national analog to a public square of that kind. But we don't seem really to have that at this point. We have this kind of balkanized set of fora, right? Distinct fora. So there's this forum where you and I are talking right now, and all of our friends who are listening or watching are sort of listening as well, or sort of taking part. And presumably some are commenting by sending in their comments. And so we have a sort of conversation going here. And there are other sort of similar conversations that go on all the time, all over the place. But when it comes to sort of one big sort of single forum where we all might be listening to one another or talking and forming a common mind together, the closest thing that there is to that seems to be big media, but none of that is actually public, right? All of that is privately owned, and it's always sort of carrying on with some privately conceived agenda. And of course, it's usually an agenda that seeks to entrench certain advantages that the advantaged people who are able to pay for that particular forum wish to see advanced, right? And of course, the latest, and I suppose the most egregious case of this of late that's recently come out is this story about Sinclair Media, which of course is buying up stations all over the place. And apparently all of the affiliates are now required to put out a certain number of minutes per day finding fault with other media, and of course finding fault with progressives and so forth. So the first thing that's lacking is any kind of single public forum, any sort of national equivalent or counterpart to the old town square that we think of when we think of local democracy back in the 18th or early 19th centuries, or a common field at which we can listen to Lincoln and Douglas debate for 4 hours or 6 hours, and where we can actually pose questions to them and the like. The second thing it seems that we're missing, I think we're missing largely because of the first thing that we're missing, and that is we don't really seem to have a sort of a coherent, well thought through, well articulated agenda. We don't seem to have an interconnected set of ideas about what we as a people, we as a polity, we as a nation, or we as a world ought to be doing, right? We have various little bits and pieces of ideas, right? Sort of fragments of ideas here and there. Oftentimes we form them sort of in response to or in reaction to certain other ideas that are being put forth that are very wrong, right? By, again, some of the usual suspects, the sort of advantaged types. And so we have these kind of piecemeal sets of we have these sets of sort of piecemeal responses to sort of falsehoods that are propagated by the advantaged. And of course, some people have pretty well articulated and pretty thought through visions of where we ought to be going, but we don't as a whole, right, as a people or as even the progressive movement seem to have a kind of single platform of that sort. And it seems to me this is another very important thing about your forum that you're providing here, because in a certain sense, you're giving us the sort of wherewithal to sort of brainstorm together to sort of arrive at something along those lines. But those are the first two things. There's some other things too, but I should probably take a pause here and see if that sounds plausible to you. Oh, I'm sorry, Steve, I'm not hearing you.
That's because I had myself muted.
Sorry.
So I look at it like this. We have within this quote unquote, I don't like using the word left because I don't believe Americans really know what the word left is. But in this country, the people that are seeking, a community, seeking a government to take care of the people, to be there for the people, to serve the general welfare, and to make life less unbearable, so to speak. I believe that we, as a team of people that are actually trying to find answers to, solutions, if you will, we're in this tough bind of chasing a million trails to find solutions to fix problems. Our enemy, however, has got it simple. Government bad, cut spending, deficits bad, debt bad, no. Government is why everything's screwed up. Less government, better life. That's our story. We're sticking to it. And the other side, well, we got to democratize the dollar. We got to do this. And then all of a sudden you've got a million forms of lunacy where people have gone through these conspiracy-laden, fact-less things, or maybe they have a hint of a fact somewhere where it's just enough to lend it enough credibility to get a bunch of people seeking a James Bond novel out to chase it down. And so we're scattered a million dots on a board, whereas they're making a single straight line to their goal, which is destroy the social safety nets, destroy the viability of a government for the people, and make it so weak and powerless that corporations and other interests, non-government entities, have complete control of our lives. Mm-hmm. And that to me is a very dangerous situation. And I don't quite know how to overcome that because, I think we have the right answers. I believe that with the partnerships with the academics that we work, we have the right answers. Mm-hmm. But there's groups out there, the Green Party, other alternative independent parties, folks that have too much time on their hands digging through these 3 a.m. blogs for truths that aren't there. And what it does is it creates a scattered, there is no movement. You can't have a movement. The movement is on the right. The right has a movement. Yeah. I hate to say it to you. The right has a movement. It's a bad movement, but it's a movement. Yeah. And we're sitting there staring in envy.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a sense in which they have it easier than we have it. It's a little easier in one way for them to have a movement because in a certain sense, what they're just saying is, look, let's just undo everything. Let's destroy everything that was so painstakingly constructed over the course of decade after decade after decade, right? We had a kind of a laissez-faire bonanza in the late 19th century in this country. The country was in serious trouble because of it. Wealth, of course, was very much skewed up at the top of the distribution. The country was going through every 10 years major depressions, major financial crises or crashes, followed by long-term debt deflation, unemployment, and immiseration. And, to their credit, a number of people came together in the late 19th century and began to form a movement that at the time, of course, was called the Progressive Movement. So plus ça change, as they say. And they worked painstakingly, decade after decade after decade, to sort of little by little, sort of incrementally turn this economy into something a little bit more humane, a little bit closer to a kind of democratically controlled set of productive relations and productive processes. And in a certain sense, it reached its apogee or the sort of crowning achievement, I suppose you could say, at least on the purely economic side of it, would have been at the time of the New Deal. But then there was an incremental improvement or building upon even the New Deal by the Truman administration, by the, believe it or not, the Eisenhower administration, a Republican administration, and then, of course, a bit by the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations, in particular by ensuring that all of the progress that had been made up through the New Deal was finally distributed widely across the entire population, ethnically speaking, as well as sort of economic class speaking, right? The great problem with the New Deal, of course, was that in order to get the votes of Southern Democrats, Roosevelt had to sort of compromise on certain aspects of the New Deal that made it fall short of treating all Americans as being equal, irrespective of their ethnicities. So one way to sort of think of the Johnson years, I think, the so-called Great Society programs, was as a way of sort of completing the New Deal to ensure that it wasn't just for white folk, but that it sort of began to spread across the entirety of the population. But then, of course, the reaction kicked in, starting with the Nixon administration, but really gathering steam during the Reagan years, and of course, it's been gathering steam ever since. And all they do, right, is if you needed a sort of a master key or sort of a simple slogan way of characterizing everything they've been doing over the last 40 years or so, I think a fair beginning would be to say they're basically trying piece by piece just to sort of deconstruct or take apart that sort of painstakingly built sort of economic democracy that we spent the better part of a century trying to build. So it seems to me that that makes their job easier in a sense, right? There's a sense in which their agenda has already been provided to them. It was provided to them by us, right? Because it's what we have, or it's what we had at the time that Reagan took office. And they just say, okay, not that. And so they just figure out strategically which piece can they take away next. And they basically, I think it looks as though what they say is, okay, let's start with the weakest link. We'll blast that one out. Let's crush the labor movement, for example, which Reagan, of course, began to do during the PATCO strike. And then they say, oh, now let's see if we can cut back on welfare or other forms of social insurance. And they sort of little by little to sort of dismantle piece by piece what our forebears kind of painstakingly built up. And in that sense, we've given them their agenda. We've given it to them in the form of the polity that we right now have. And our job is harder then, because we can't simply say, well, let's just rebuild what they have taken apart. We have to build something that is the functional equivalent of it, but something that's, say, suitable to the 21st century. Now, I think there's actually a lot in the original New Deal vision that can still be put in place and can still be defended. But there are updated forms as well, right? There are modernized, streamlined forms of New Deal plans and New Deal programs that we can push as well. But that's the thing, is we have to do something. Our task is a constructive task. Theirs is a destructive task. And as we all know, it's always easier to tear something down than it is to construct it, especially if you construct it over time in a kind of piece by piece, painstaking manner.
It's interesting you say that, because as we come through here, I like to consider myself logical, definitely a hothead when I feel like people aren't paying attention, but I consider myself to be a logical person. And when I listen to folks throughout, let's just say hypothetically, just a short window of time going back to the beginning of Bernie Sanders' campaign.
Yeah.
Everyone was suddenly waking up. I was watching in like real time the Overton window move left. I was literally watching. I was like having to turn my head with it because it was happening in front of me. And I was like, wow, this is powerful, right? Yeah. It wasn't even about Bernie. It was about the collective consciousness saying, holy shit, we could do something different.
Yeah.
And it was that moment. I want to make sure our audience understands, whether you love Bernie or whether you hate Bernie, this isn't about Bernie, because Bernie can't win anything without us. This is about us being awake and seeing the possibilities, the realm of possibilities. Mm-hmm. And neoliberalism has conditioned us to see a horrible idea and a slightly less horrible idea. And we have to latch on naturally to the slightly less horrible idea, because after all, we only consider our world in two possible fashions. Now, first past the post voting and stuff like that, I don't even want to get into that right now, because that's not what this is about. There's a lot of years in between elections, right? So this is about us talking between now and then and building movements. And I saw the realm of possibility shift before our eyes.
Yeah.
People are cynical. People still didn't take the lessons of that time, regardless of some of the other hurtful things that they feel occurred. There is some other factors there that should have worked as an enlightenment to us, to give us that opportunity to demand things. And I still don't see consensus around what we once had consensus about.
Yeah.
Again, it's a powerful drug, cynicism, to diminish energy, to diminish focus, and to otherwise render a movement incompetent and unable to fight against the enemy that is truly, truly organized and quite frankly, well-funded.
Yeah.
What do we do with this, Bob, at this point?
Well, there are a few things I think that we can do. I mean, one of the things that I thought was most remarkable about Bernie's campaign and about the movement around it was that it suddenly became safe just to say why not about all sorts of things that everybody had previously sort of taken for granted were impossible, right? Because it's just not done or it's just not said, right? So, Bernie comes out and says, well, yeah, we're a civilized society. Everybody ought to have access to health insurance. Why are we talking about saying, well, now we're down to only 11% of the population that's uninsured, or, be careful, we might get back up to 15 or 16 or 20% who don't have access to health insurance. And finally, somebody comes along and says, why are we talking about, let's get it down from 16 to 11, or let's get it down from 20 to 12 or whatever. Why don't we just say every single person is going to have access to health insurance? Every other civilized society has this. Every other, at least materially advanced civilized society has this. Why couldn't we, right? This is not who we are. I mean, we've always been the can-do people, or at least that was our self-image as Americans. We can get it done. We can do it. And now we're the only ones in the world who seem to be saying, well, we can't do it. We're the only ones who can't do it. I mean, it's insane, right? And sort of similarly, people talk about, well, let's see how low we can get that unemployment rate. Can we bring it back down from 11 or 9% to 6% or to 5% or 4%? Or is there, how low can we go before we start stoking inflation? There is a natural rate of unemployment after all, right? Don't forget the Phillips curve. I mean, it's just complete rubbish, isn't it? I mean, shouldn't we completely flip that and say that the scandal isn't it preposterous? How can any civilized society be such that there are people who want to be able to earn a livelihood who simply can't? Sorry. I mean, it would be one thing if we all lived in a forest that was basically wide open and not fully inhabited. So, if you ever, if you run out of opportunity in your little village or whatever in 1780 or something, you can always go out, further west into the woods. And of course, there are other people there too, but at least it's not heavily populated. So maybe you can actually find a little patch of land and grow something on it and live on it. And then you could, you might say, well, okay, under circumstances like that, maybe it isn't so crazy that we don't guarantee everybody a job, because there is always some way to go out and support yourself, right? But now, for the last over 100 years, actually, last 120, 140 years, I mean, basically all of the land is owned, and again, leaving to one side the fact of our conquest of it, that we took it away from others. But even apart from that, I mean, there's just the fact that all of it is owned now. You can't just kind of strike out on your own and just begin supporting yourself off the land or off of the earth. And so how preposterous, how can it possibly be right that there are people who want to be able and are willing and ready and able to begin to support themselves, and there's just no place for you to do that. It's all taken. It's ridiculous. We should talk about a 0% unemployment rate. I mean, at least zero involuntary unemployment. Obviously, there are people who are between jobs and all of that. But I mean, and the thing that was so exciting, I thought, at least about the 2016. The lead up to the 2016 election during the primaries, was that finally somebody was just basically talking the way a kid might talk, like, why don't we have zero unemployment? Why don't we have zero uninsured? Because those are the right questions to be asking, and any answer that you, right? And any answer you get to the effect that, well, because blah, 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 is almost certainly going to be sophistical. It's almost always going to be a case of sheer sophistry or a complete lack of imagination, which is also kind of hard to understand. I mean, how can anybody be that unimaginative? So one of the things that you just said that made me literally cringe and at the same time feel some hope, right? We see all of a sudden in the news, we see a lot of stuff coming around about a job guarantee. However, populism, which certainly is required for revolution, is not exactly something that you can control. It seems to be something, or maybe you can control. We just don't have the sophistication on this side to control where it goes. But the reality is that there are always these poison pills, these neoliberal poison pills that they throw in there to divert. And it's like watching a starling swarm. Yeah. Making beautiful swirls, but they're not getting anywhere. And they leave a lot of crap behind them.
Absolutely. And so we're sitting there and in the most coherent fashion I know, we're saying, guys, let's focus on solving the problem of unemployment, healthcare, education. Let's keep the planet alive and well so that we can stay living on a planet.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and make sure families are able to not have to make a choice between paying the electric bill and feeding their son. I mean, it seems so impossibly simple. And what you said, Bernie came out there and said this stuff, and the neoliberal narrative came in with an almost dismissive chuckle of, ha, 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 how are you going to pay for it? And things like that. And there you are with the most basic concept. Yeah. And the American people literally, if you watch every election and every debate, the Republicans usually do it. This time, the centrist Democrat did it to Bernie. But usually it's the Republicans that sit there and say, well, how are you going to pay for it? You fail simple maths. Even Roseanne Barr the other night on her return to the screen was sitting there mocking her sister for wanting to have health care for all. And that brings me to the point that I was driving to here. The answer to this is a balkanization of humanity by saying, we'll give it to the people that don't have. We'll give it to some people, but we won't give it to all people. And so naturally, the poison pill of not giving it to all people creates bitterness, resentment, and it creates a situation that we already know going in. If it wins, it's going to create a lot of bitterness. Most likely it won't win because you have enough people that won't be able to win here. Why can't we have citizens' benefits? Why isn't this revolution about lifting everyone up? Why do we keep skinning this group over there, skinning that group over there, and trying literally to segment and separate and minimize our impact by making only this little tiny group will benefit?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the trick, man, to keeping us slaves.
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, it could be thought of as a kind of divide and conquer strategy, whether it's sort of intentionally planned that way or whether it simply functions that way. Either way, there is a kind of divide and conquer effect here. There's also just the very fact of arguing this way encourages people to assume the very thing that is assumed in any argument of this form, which is to assume that incremental is the only way you can go, right? That there is no way to do it except sort of little by little by little. If you say, hey, yeah, I hear where I see where you're coming from. I'm with you on this. We can't move too fast, however, so let's, shave off a couple of percent here this time. And then maybe in about 5 or 10 years, we'll come back at this and we'll shave off another 2 or 3%. And, eventually we'll get down to where only maybe 5% of the population is uninsured, or maybe only about 5% of the population is unemployed. And the thing is, I think what happens when people argue in that way is it encourages all of us to think, actually, that there's a kind of scarcity here that we have to deal with, or that we can only accommodate a few people at a time. It essentially encourages acceptance of this very insidious and subversive assumption, which simply isn't true. And not to be too much of a kind of New Deal fetishist here, but as a matter of sort of strategy, we can actually learn certain strategic lessons from the way things were packaged and pushed back in the 1930s and the 1940s and in other decades as well. The easiest case in point here is Social Security. So as you might know, as perhaps we talked about before, every single American receives Social Security, even rich people. And of course, in the 1930s, when there was debate about this newfangled Social Security Act that might be enacted, people were saying, "Well, why give it to the rich? They don't need it. They don't need retirement insurance. They're well accounted. I mean, they're well accommodated already." And the counter argument was, "Well, yeah, that's true, but we want to emphasize, right? The optics here are important. We want to emphasize this is literally something for every American as a right of citizenship, whether you be wealthy or not. And if you're wealthy and you're receiving Social Security, well, sure, maybe we'll tax you more because you have more than you need. But and while other people, need are not satisfied or are not fully accommodated. But the point is that this particular program is going to be literally for everybody. We don't, for example, when we talk about national defense, we don't say, well, the Army is only going to defend the bottom 80% of Americans in terms of income because the rich people can simply hire Blackwater to take care of them. No, the Army, the military supposedly defends the entirety of the country, and we don't draw distinctions between citizens along sort of income lines. And the idea behind Social Security was that it was going to be similar, right? We recognize that certain things are incidents of citizenship itself. They come with your being here. They come with your being an American. And that's, I think, a very smart way to think about these things. And in a sense, it's the very antithesis of that. If you say, well, we're just going to, we'll raise the minimum wage up to $12, but 15 is going too far. Or, we'll get it down to only 11% uninsured, but 5, that's too far. Or, 0, that's certainly too far. That's pie in the sky. And again, like you said yourself, I think I think you said it better than I can. It's a very sort of subversive, divide and conquerish way of framing things.
I look at, like, for example, the New York City free college stuff. They're looking to get, and again, they're going with a hey, you make this much money based kind of approach to things. And I certainly understand vengeance politics, so to speak. And there's some case for a progressive way of, scaled kind of thing when it comes to taxation and stuff like that. Other ways in which we make sure things impact people kind of proportionately, if you will, in terms of their ability to survive that taking away from, right? But when I look at what the seeds of revolution are, and I look at this country and I say, my God, we're chock full of guns. We've got guns everywhere. We are a powder keg in many ways. Yeah. And we've got people that are desperate. Before we got on this on the live show here, you and I spoke at length about wage slavery and the difference between the South and the North was, down here you bought your slave, up there you rent your slave. And, right now, you've got people that are genuinely feeling very, very unfulfilled. They go to work. It's terrible. They're moving paper from one side of the desk to the other side. They know they're not curing cancer. They know they're not really helping anyone in any meaningful way. And then they say, oh, shit, if I say something about that, maybe they'll let me go. And I need that because I've got to feed my kid. I've got to have health care. And if I don't get it through my employer, I'm not going to have it. Or if I get it through the marketplace, it's going to be through the roof and I'm not going to be able to, pay the co-pays or whatever. So they got you, and that's not freedom. That's not freedom at all. And so people are trapped, they're angry, but they're not uniting towards one goal because of the shotgun scatter approach. Mm-hmm. You nailed it. Destruction's far easier than building. But I think we kind of have something here. I think we all kind of came during that shift of the Overton window. Mm-hmm. I think we have something here. But there's some snakes in the tall grass, right? This concept of a universal basic income strikes people very, very, it sounds good. They heard MLK talk about it many, many moons ago, long ago, before he got his economics. No, he didn't get an economics degree, but long before, this whole thing came up. But Milton Friedman wanted the same thing. And Paul Ryan would love this. And the Koch brothers and Cato Institute would love a UBI. And they love a UBI because it's their Trojan horse to rip away the rest of the New Deal, to destroy the social safety nets, to actually subsidize wages. So not only are they renting slaves, but we're subsidizing wage slavery that way. Mm-hmm. And you look at it and it's like, we've got this silver bullet. Does it solve all of income inequality? No. Is it a start? Yes. And a federal job guarantee. But instead, people have got it in their head, for example, that, they're just going to be digging holes and filling holes, digging holes, filling holes. And we've not said anything like that. So the disinformation campaign on everything from selling a UBI, which I consider to be, quite frankly, not only a Trojan horse to destroy the New Deal, but also I consider it like a school voucher. There's a reason progressives didn't want school vouchers. And it's because the wealthy still get to go where they want to go, and the poor kids still end up stuck. $5,000 isn't getting them into the good school. It's just getting them in the regular school. The same school that was screwed before is now screwed again. And so it's status quo, as Pavlina would say. What is the allure? Why is neoliberalism such a draw to would-be progressives? How is it that we can't see past this? Is it an academic issue? Is it a framing issue? Or is it just the pure fabric of society and the way our sitcoms and our books and our newspapers and everything from the water cooler to when we go to bed at night is wired for neoliberalism? I don't know. But I can tell you, for revolution based on the misery we feel, based on the lack of hope many feel right now, you would think revolution would be right there. Not a violent revolution, hopefully, but nonetheless a spirited joining together to fight back. And it's not happening. I don't see it anyway. I mean, what do you have to say to that?
Yeah, so I think there are a few things that, and these are just, okay, yeah. So there are a few things here that I think might be at work. I mean, again, this is sort of impressionistic on my part, but so one thing I think that's at work here is somehow or another, I don't know whether this was a concerted effort or whether this just sort of happened by accident, but somehow or another, it has come to pass that many Americans, in a kind of Pavlovian way, not Pavlinian way, but Pavlovian way, sort of associate the idea of efficiency or lean and mean and no waste and no fat and so forth with the so-called private sector. And then they associate kind of bloat and make work and fill holes and empty holes and fill holes and empty holes with the public sector. And so the neoliberals, I think, are essentially the descendants of these third-way Democrats who Clinton, of course, got on the map back in the late 80s and early 90s, who told us that, you can kind of have it both ways. We can have the kind of the lean and the mean and the efficient of the market or of the private sector with a kind of a human face or a sort of a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down, and that'll be what the public sector does. And so one of the first things I think that we have to do is point out that you've got all of the same bloat, all of the same inefficiency, all of the same forms of corruption in the private sector that you ever find in the public sector. And indeed, you have it much more. The difference is that in the private sector, a lot of it is legal, and so it's not per se scandalous. Whereas when it happens in the public sector, it's illegal, and so it is scandalous. But the same forms of corruption, that kind of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, various forms of graft, various, sort of it's not who you know, it's not what you know, it's who you know, sort of where you get in life and so forth. So much of this is about cronyism, about who you know and about whose back you scratch or who you sort of or kowtow to or who you sort of satisfy or make happy. There's so much waste in the private sector that there's absolutely no reason to be sort of seduced by the image of the sort of efficiency that comes from private sector operations. And therefore, there's no need and there's no reason to be privatizing things or to think of private as being better than public. Especially the larger the organization, right? The huge private sector organizations, the huge firms are gigantic bloated bureaucracies. Of course, we've all experienced this. You have trouble with your mobile phone and you phone up your mobile provider to get the thing taken care of. I suspect that any of the worst language that you've heard from any Republican politician complaining about, bloated bureaucrats or lazy bureaucrats or unelected bureaucrats, I suspect all of that would carry over quite immediately to anybody, in describing any experience that you've had with any large corporation that is a provider of some so-called service to you when you call up because the service is not being provided properly. So, so the first thing is I think we have to explode this strange, again, Pavlovian association pursuant to which people hear private sector, lean, mean, efficient, no fat, everything's kind of working smoothly, right? No soft budget constraint there. There's the market to discipline them. There's no market discipline when you're in an oligopolistic industry, or especially when you're in a monopolistic industry. And of course, as you know, we're getting more and more and more concentration, or we're seeing more and more concentration in more and more industries. So that's the first thing, is I think we have to recognize that there's no reason to think of the private sector as somehow the home of efficiency and smooth operations and non-corruption and non-cronyism, and of the public sector as being all of those things, the opposite. The second and related thing, I think, is we've come to think, for whatever reason, of freedom as being always freedom from government, or freedom from the state, or freedom from public action. But nobody ever seems to think about or talk about freedom from, say, corporate influence, or freedom from an environment that is determined by these sort of private sector entities that own virtually everything now, right? Nobody ever thinks of freedom from them. But it's the same form of freedom we're talking about. And the best way to make that clear, I think, is actually just to sort of switch over altogether and stop thinking about freedom from, and start thinking about freedom to. Ask, what do we want to be free to do? And then we ask, who the fuck is actually standing in the way? Sorry, pardon the French. Who is actually preventing us from doing the things that we want to do, that we would seem to have every natural right to do? Who are the obstacles? What are the obstacles? What's standing in the way? I can't think of a single thing that I've actually literally wanted to do in the last 20 or 30 years that any government or government instrumentality has prevented me from doing, right? I never wanted to rob anybody. I suppose the government would have stopped me, or the police would have stopped me if I tried to commit a robbery. At least I hope they would. But I've never wanted to do that. There's not a single, decent...
God.
Yeah, don't tell me. There's not a single legitimate, decent thing that I've ever wanted to do that any government instrumentality has ever stood in the way of my doing. When I ask myself, what have been the obstacles? What has stood in my way when I wanted to do something that it seemed to be perfectly reasonable to want to do, or maybe even noble to want to do? The only obstacles I've ever faced have been put up by private sector people. And so, if we can kind of draw this to people's attention, my guess is if you actually asked somebody to think about this and had a serious conversation with even with many right wingers, and say, tell me the last 10 things that you wanted to do that you weren't able to do, and then tell me what stopped you. I would bet you that anybody being honest with you would say at least 8 out of those 10 would have been private sector actors. Probably all 10 of them would have been. So if we get people to start thinking of freedom to rather than freedom from, or the next best thing, if they insist on thinking of freedom from, to note that, you want freedom from various private sector impediments just as much as you want freedom from public sector impediments, I think that would be helpful as well. And then maybe the final point that sort of, again, connects up with those two things is, ask yourself, think about all of the different organizations that you sort of encounter or sort of think about on a daily or weekly basis, and ask yourself, is any one of these organizations, or is some number of these organizations, something that I'm actually in a certain sense a part of, that it's like acting in my name? And actually, there are very few, but the very few that are public sector, right? I mean, it's the United States that purports to be acting in my name. Verizon isn't acting in my name. Verizon isn't acting in our name, but the bloody United States government is acting in our name. Now, of course, it's not currently doing what we would want it to be doing, because it's, of course, there's a pirate in the White House at this point. It's essentially been sort of, taken over and commandeered by these kind of Koch brother types and these Mercer types. But the thing is that itself is interesting, right? We view this as scandalous, right? That somebody like that is in the White House. But if somebody like that were in charge of Verizon, we wouldn't think that that's scandalous. We think, well, that's how the market works. That's how it's supposed to be. And that tells you something, right? It tells us that, well, yeah, we think of the market as essentially like some kind of a jungle, full of cannibals and, and just it's sort of loathsome behavior. And it's just normal there. But the public sector, we demand something more noble. We demand something that's more honorable. And that's precisely why it is that we're scandalized by what Trump does in the White House, whereas nobody really was scandalized about Trump doing the same sort of crap as a so-called real estate mogul. other than the various people he cheated. But you know, so I think that's critically important too. I mean, if the public sector is us, right? It's our instrument. It's our instrumentality. It's the thing through which we, the largest possible we, the we of the entire nation, the people that actually supposedly promulgated that constitution that everybody claims to worship and so many people sort of fetishize. The nation is the thing that constitution constitutes, and that means it's something that we constitute. And Verizon is not that. Sinclair Media is not that. Fox News is not that. MSNBC is not that. And I don't see. So I think, you know, maybe a start then would be to kind of get people to think this a little bit about what they're actually committing themselves to when they sort of casually slag off the state or slag off the public sector or casually extol the so-called virtues and efficiencies of the private sector, because it's just nonsense.
Well, what is efficiency anyway, right? I mean, this is what always amazes me. I mean, when they think of efficiency, most people, when I hear them talking about efficiency, they're not talking about quality service. They're not talking about getting you in line and getting you taken care of with a smile. They're talking about saving money, okay? Yeah. And the federal government is probably the only institution that we all have available to us that really shouldn't have that constraint. Yeah. So why is it that we can't make these institutions run efficiently in the real sense, in other words, serving us and being effective and providing them the tools? And I can tell you my opinion of this, and you're watching this globally happen. USA is exporting its number one export, and that's neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. It's exporting it to the UK. It's exporting it to Australia. It's exporting it even to China by sending their economists and central bankers here to learn how to sit there and be Scrooge and take care of the corporations versus taking care of the people. Mm. I will tell you, when I first started thinking about what this show would be about, I really kind of started thinking, we had talked a lot about some of the failures of some of these previous revolutions and the fact that they would get spun up and they never ended up really being able to achieve anything. I mean, they different varying levels of achievement, but where I'm at right now is we have such disinformation. We have so little to lock in on and say, because these private corporations that control what we hear and read and everything else are telling us a million different stories. It's like, well, what do I believe? Yeah. What's the truth? What do I latch onto? And so people go back into a cocoon and hide again and just accept being a slave, a wage slave, that nothing good can possibly happen. Mm-hmm. What would it, I don't know what it would take to get people in this country, given the apparatuses that are there to pump garbage out. Mm-hmm. What would it take to get a knowledge revolution going in this country, to get a truth revolution going so that we can, in fact, act in our own best interest? It may be what you said earlier about Bernie Sanders asking questions like a child. Why can't we? Why can't we? I don't know what the answer is on that, but I do know that when I hear you talk, when I hear Stephanie Kelton talk, when I hear Randall Wray, Bill Mitchell, the whole Binzagr team, all of the Modern Money Network, and all the other folks that are dedicated tooth and nail, round the clock, to bringing about truth and economic progress, I feel hope. But we're saying things that make people lose their mind because they're so conditioned to misery. They're so conditioned to not winning that any sense of it almost feels like gaslighting to them, I'm assuming. Yeah. How do we overcome that? Because, I mean, I'm watching people wake up. I am watching it, but it's not happening fast enough. I worry that people are still sleepwalking and that we aren't going to see the kind of change. Is it just pure happenstance that these revolutions occur, or what do we have to do given the constraints of society today to get people to have a knowledge revolution and wake up? Doing everything I can. I don't know what more to do.
Yeah, I mean, the glib answer would be we need a lot more Steve Grumbines, right? I mean, we need a lot more people doing what you're doing. And again, I can't. It sounds like I'm being facetious or something, but I do think you're a national treasure. And this is your effort is is a treasure. And there are, of course, various counterpart efforts that sort of work in their various ways, including, of course, the Modern Money Network, all of whom are your and my friends, and the MMT folk, and there are other groups as well that are doing great things. And all of that, I think, is important, and all of it seems to be making progress or headway sort of little by little. And it's worth maybe occasionally pausing to sort of take stock of how far we've come in a way over the last 7 or 8 years, largely thanks to those folk, right? So, and this isn't going to be Pollyannish, because I'm going to pivot to what more I think we have to do in just a moment. But just by way of a kind of a quick stock taking, if you think back to, 2008, let's say 10 years ago, just about the time of the crash, I don't think most people had ever heard of MMT, or most people had ever heard. I don't even think there was a Modern Money Network at that point, right? There were certainly money cranks beginning to come out of the woodwork, right? The Lyndon LaRouche people, of course, had a field day after the crash. And as you know, you and I have talked about this before, when the so-called occupation at Wall Street began in the autumn of 2011, I was working at the New York Fed, and I would work at the Fed during the day, and then I camped over at the site at night and spent every night chatting with people. And of course, the place, it was a wonderful sort of effervescent sort of situation with lots of different ideas being talked about. And Randy came down actually and talked to the group down there at the park one day. Bill McKibben came down and talked to everybody one day. But you also had these kind of LaRoucheites and various other kinds of weird money crank types who were talking about going back to the gold standard and thought of themselves as lefties, thought of themselves as progressives, wanting to go back to the gold standard and saying we should lynch Ben Bernanke for debasing the currency and so forth. That was a pretty strange state of the public mind, right? But it was a kind of you can think of it, I suppose, as the very beginning of a kind of awakening to the fact that, first of all, something is profoundly wrong. Second of all, Wall Street or the financial system have something to do with it. Third of all, money has something to do with it and how we conceive of money. And that was a kind of progress, right? But then in the ensuing years, from 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, little by little, it seems that this kind of inarticulate sense that there's something wrong with the economy, that the financial system is somehow connected to it, and that money is somehow connected to it, began gradually to become more articulate. And people began to grow a little bit more able over time to sort of pinpoint what it is that's wrong with the economy, or what it is that's wrong with the financial system, and what money actually does have to do with it. And now, of course, it's amazing how many even mainstream fora include references to or interviews with or snippets of conversation from people who are actually clear on money, people like Stephanie, people like Randy, people like our friends who started at MMN, and of course our MMN friends, right, Rowan and Nathan and Raul. The way they've spread the word across the universities all over the country, where, and especially at law schools, but not only at law schools, where lots of young people are learning and are curious and energetic and wanting to go out and change things after they graduate. This is of immense value, so that if we actually do come to where we're able to sort of articulate a kind of common agenda, it'll be no small thanks to you and to them and to the MMT people who've been toiling in the vineyard for decades now and are finally kind of beginning to get their due. So there's at least that, right? We're getting there. But as you said, I'm in agreement with you that we've got to do more, and I think we're going to have to speed it up before things implode even worse, because they certainly could. And I've been thinking about this a lot too, just like you have, and of course you and I have been thinking aloud together on this stuff for a while too. But I find my brain is now obsessively circling back again and again and again to how we construct public dialogue. I mean, what we actually don't have in the way of a kind of analog to this public square idea, right? There's on the one hand, it's the balkanization problem, which is familiar and lots of people have pointed to. And if you think of it as like everybody's in their own little cocoon, and then we're all in our own echo chambers, and we just listen to the people we want to hear, and so we just sort of reinforce our views with one another and so forth. That is a problem, of course, and that one's been pointed to for a while now. But what sort of gets ignored is the kind of flip of that, which is that there actually just is no common space. There's not one common mind space, so to speak, where everybody is talking. But to go back to the Occupy movement for a moment, as you remember, there would be at every place where there was an occupation, in particular at Zuccotti Park, there were, in a sense, two levels of organization, you might say. On the one hand, there were committees that had specialized tasks that were delegated to them, right? We had a laundry committee, we had a medical committee, and in a sense, we've sort of recreated or recapitulated the history of the administrative state, right? We start as a primitive democracy, and then little by little, we develop sort of specialized agencies to do to deal with particular tasks. On the other hand, there was always still the General Assembly, right? The sort of the plenary, or the GA, right? And the General Assembly would meet every single night, and we would talk about big common problems. And this is when when Mike Check became, the sort of the day. And it was a beautiful and a wonderful thing. And it seems to me there's a sense in which you can think of all of us right now in the sort of progressive movement, insofar as it's a movement, or maybe the progressive orientation, the progressive sort of flow, as we have all the committees in a certain sense, but we don't have the General Assembly, right? We don't have the analog to the occupation's General Assembly. And if that's true of us as a large movement, it's even more true of the nation, right? The nation ought to have a kind of a GA, so to speak, some kind of a General Assembly where if somebody shouts "Mike Check" and then everybody listens to that person, the human microphone kind of amplifies everybody, and we all hear one another. And over time, have a kind of, I don't want to sound too mystical or too Star Trek-ish about it, but we have a kind of a Vulcan mind meld throughout the polity. There's no space in which that can happen at the moment, it seems to me. And it seems to me that we used to sort of try to do something at least a little bit like that, like the old fairness doctrine that the FCC used to enforce on the media back when there were only 3 major television networks. If they gave time, if they gave airtime for some political opinion to be expressed, they had to give equal airtime for contrary opinions to be expressed. And it was a very imperfect way of attaining some degree of sort of conversational equity, but at least it was recognizing that as a desideratum, and it actually did seem to have at least some effect. It seems to, and then of course, as you know, during the late Reagan period, they scrapped the fairness doctrine, and almost immediately thereafter, Fox News comes along, and then Sinclair Media, and these other kind of balkanized media. So I'm not sure exactly what the solution is going to look like, but it seems to me there has to be some way of providing one big public forum at which everybody is somehow involved, right? That everybody is sort of contributing to in some way, so that there actually is a national conversation rather than just a bunch of sort of subnational ear whisperings, or water cooler conversations or what have you.
Well, it's interesting. I'm sitting there going through, like, offline here. You don't see me doing this, but I'm trying desperately to bring up this Kate Aronoff article from The Intercept. I have it right there.
Okay.
And I'm struggling to find the one point that she makes, but I'll go ahead and try to bring it about. Mm-hmm. I'm going to make this solo for the crowd to see here. Okay. And this right here, she goes into some great details about what it'll take to get people to get past, what they know and so forth. And they're saying basically, for a reason, job guarantee proponents see it as a political gift that keeps on giving. There's something for everyone. They go through this whole litany throughout. But what it comes down to, and I'll just skip it because rather than trying to find it, it's a little bit more challenging than I thought. But what she says, and it's really incredible, is it's going to take more than a politician to get this stuff done. It's going to take the people. It's going to take outside things happening. And that's where I see your work as you go down. I think next week you're going down to Florida with some other folks to talk about, a New Deal. And then I believe it's a New Deal you guys would be talking about. But it's all this education that we're doing as part of this as we infect, I like to consider a rogue strain of truth, infecting the media, infecting these people, making it so that they can't wiggle away, so that it's perfectly unacceptable to say things that we know are not true anymore, that we have debunked, and we don't give up, because if we don't hold a very firm line with this, ultimately we'll slink back to things that are comfortable. And those things that are comfortable might be a bloody nose and a broken arm, but we know them, we love them, and we'll nurse them, and we'll learn to walk with a limp. We want to fix the leg. We want to fix all this stuff. And so these town halls and these other things that you're talking about, this shared public space, this, it's on us, I think, at least partially anyway, to try and make a grassroots element of that through use of social media, through use of these nonprofits and these other organizations that are actively seeking to bring about this truth. But I think it's going to take a combination between these think tanks and them breaking free from being purely academic and being able to really treat, like we're doing right now, really truly reaching into the grassroots, reaching into the public space. And it does no good to sit there in an ivory tower with your pinky out talking about, this is such a grand idea, Charlie. Yes, indeed, yes. We need the regular folks to adopt this and say it in their own language and make connections, vital connections here and here, so that they move to that beat. I'm really excited. Bob, every time I hear you speak, and if you watch the comments, the people love what you're saying. You are truly speaking in a way that people understand, clearly articulate, etc. There's just not enough Bob Hocketts in the world. You don't have enough time to be everybody's soothsayer. What would you say, because we're running out of time, we're actually a little over time, what would you say to the people that are watching right now, some of the things that they personally could do to both gain knowledge and also be a part of building the solution so that they're not wandering in the wilderness? What would your parting advice be to them?
Yeah, so I guess I don't know that I have anything that hasn't been said a million times before by lots of people who are much better than I am at this, but it does seem that among the things that everybody can do is to keep spreading the word about, first of all, your program, right? The Real Progressives Live program, and to get people to kind of listen or play back, right, past programs, because you've got so many great people who come on this program regularly, right? And just to sort of turn people on to even just your guest list alone, right, present company excluded, would be a university education in itself, right? If more people actually were just going to go back into your archives and look at all of those past programs, that itself would be immensely helpful. Another thing that would be really, really helpful, I think, is for everybody just to get onto Google and just Google, say, job guarantee, for example, and begin to get some exposure to that. Maybe Google Medicare for all, right? That would be another thing that would be worth Googling, because there's a lot of really good thought out there on some version of Medicare for all, right? Some version of health insurance for everybody. And there's a lot of good stuff out there on the job guarantee, which then opens out into this kind of broader and more sort of fundamental and more universal principle, which is that, again, it's a scandal that in any civilized society with material wherewithal, that anybody who wants and is able and ready to earn a living, to do something worthwhile, to be remunerated for it, is that anybody who wants that and is able to and willing to do that simply can't have it. Really, you're just not even going to be allowed to work. The sheer scandal of that, again, it's preposterous. It's almost unbelievable that we still live like this, right? That we still live like that. And just going through some of the job guarantee literature begins to sort of strengthen that sense, or sort of deepen that sense of outrage and astonishment that we actually think this is normal, that we actually think this is okay. Maybe one other thing that might be worth, this is a sort of a personal hobby horse of mine that you and I were talking about just before we went live tonight. Just Google the phrase wage slavery, right? And read about, and that'll take you to a million different sites about what the discourse on the labor movement and labor rights was back in the 19th century. A fundamental divide formed only at the end of the 19th century between two different wings or branches, you might say, the labor movement. The one branch was, well, we just want to get better wages and better working conditions and so forth, but we're perfectly happy with still having to be hired by capitalists. That was the neoliberal wing, so to speak, of the labor movement, although by current standards, that itself sounds pretty radical now, which shows how far we've fallen. But the much more interesting wing of the labor movement that everybody seems to have forgotten about, that was personified by and pushed by the so-called what was called the Knights of Labor and the the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, was to get rid of the wage slavery system altogether. The idea was that it should just not be the case that we are hired by other people who sort of plan what it is that we need to do, sort of, and say, would they just hire us to sort of carry out their plans, and then they pay us wages to do it. That ultimately what we want is an economy where everybody is in a certain sense self-employed, whether it be in the form of cooperatives, worker co-ops, or sort of employee-owned firms, so that the same people who are employed by the firms are the owners of the firms, or whatever the arrangement would be, that basically we would be a nation of producers, not a nation of employees, right? Now that's farther out. That's beyond, in a sense, even further than the job guarantee. But in the job guarantee, I believe, will get us there eventually, because the job guarantee at least recognizes in pursuing the job guarantee, we're effectively recognizing, first of all, that we have a collective responsibility to employ us, right? To employ ourselves. And also we're recognizing that it simply should never be the case that anybody who's ready to work somehow can't work. So that begins to get us there. There's a kind of collective political self-employment, you might say, implicit in the idea of the job guarantee. And I'm convinced that in the longer run, not that long, but in the longer term, what we're ultimately going to be pushing for or getting toward is becoming an economy that is largely constituted by self-employed groups of people, where we are a nation of producers and not simply a nation of laborers who are hired by other people, right? And we'll get there. But anyway, just Googling something like wage slavery or Knights of Labor or industrial workers of the world is another way that people can, I think, begin to kind of get some exposure to a really big, huge, wonderful world of thought about economic arrangements that seems to have just disappeared to us from our consciousness in the last 4 or 5 decades, if not longer. So I think you're muted, Steve. Sorry.
Thank you.
Oh, good.
This has been an amazing night for me, Bob. I for doing this for my birthday and for Easter and my family. They asked me what I wanted. As crazy as this sounds, I just wanted to be free to do the show tonight and not have anybody interrupt me and just be okay. Because to me, I literally think this is the most important thing I can do with my life, next to being a father and so forth. You know, I really believe that my sense of self and sense of purpose is trying my best to do my best and get this word out. You know, I didn't have any idea. If somebody would have asked me if I would ever do this years ago, I would have had no clue this would have been something I would be doing. And so for me to believe this strongly in it and have the gracious guests and quite frankly, the privilege of being able to be associated with such brilliant people, such kind, good-hearted, forward-thinking people. My life is so much richer as a result of fighting this, even though we're all suffering, even though there's a lot of pain and you're not seeing the big leaps that you'd like to see.
Yeah.
The journey is so much sweeter being around like-minded people that are fighting for a common purpose. And I invite everyone to join us in this fight, because it's about our lives. It's about your children's lives. It's about the planet. And, you know, I think this is the starting point. This is like the genesis, ground zero of an intellectual revolution and a real change in the public purpose, a return to the public purpose.
Yeah.
So, Bob, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining me again. And thank you for spending my birthday with me. I really appreciate it.
Happy birthday. We all love you. And thanks so much for everything you're doing.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Folks, for Bob and myself, have a great night. Thank you very much.